2012, right? So that's the way the Nebraska statutes work. Whenever you find where the statute was stated in a reissue, go to every year after that in the supplements or cumulative supplements and see if it's been altered or restated, and indicate that in your site as well. So that's NLR Rule 2, and they give you some examples. Yes?
In the combination example, they use an ampersand when it's a reissue and a cumulative supplement.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
They use an
misspoke.
ampersand or a semicolon.
It's an ampersand, excuse me, I misspoke, yeah. Okay, so our next rule is, any other questions on that? They didn't explain it that clearly before, and I was not clear on all that, so. Okay, where did that? NLR 3, the Blue Book rule simply suggests that if you have a see also introductory signal, you put an explanatory parenthetical at the end. It's required for Nebraska. This causes our authors some consternation sometimes because we have to tell them to either add a parenthetical or change the introductory signal. But what you, as spaders, will do if you catch a see also signal without an explanatory parenthetical in any of the chain of sources that are cited after that, suggest one, and let your executive editor know, well, I went back to the source, I read how it supports the proposition, so here's perhaps one we can use. Authors will usually come up with their own, but it's nice just to offer them that. And NLR 7 is the two-space rule, which we already covered. I'm sorry, I said we were going to go through all of them, and I jumped to 7, so let's just quickly go to 4. This is simply a rule with non-statutory legal rules. We italicize them in the text. Whereas you would normally use small caps in a footnote. 5, we have a way we capitalize and indicate parts, sections, and subsections. You only capitalize part. Sections and subsections are separated by periods. Article, comment, and note. If the author is referring to their own article, comment, or note, it's capitalized. And remember that if an author is referring to someone else's article, note, etc., then it's not capitalized. Where did we go here? And I'll give you a chance to pore over this a little more thoroughly on your own time. Here we go. Excuse me. NLR 6, if you happen to get some turn-of-the-century cases, there's a particular special rule with that, and I would deal with that as it crops up. That's nothing to pay particularly close attention to right now. NLR Rule 7, 2 spaces. Okay. And those are our local rules. Any questions? Okay, the Blue Book, which your class and my class are very lucky. The previous year of law review members didn't have the Blue Book for their first year of law school, so they started spading having never looked at a Blue Book before. So you've got a little bit of a head start. And we'll remember that the blue pages are for practitioners and not for law review articles, so you'll be skipping that section. And the ones I'm noting here are good ones to mark because you'll be going to them a lot, and as you can see, I've got well-worn tabs that I've made use of quite a bit. So first, our introductory signals. Just going to pay attention to whether those are being used correctly in the article. Remember the comma after an EG is not italicized. Contradictory signals need to be in different citation sentences, but signals indicating the same position, like supporting or contradicting, can be separated by semicolons. Uh, 1.3 is a pretty important one, and this is one authors tend to goof up a lot, so it's something to always keep an eye out for, and it's a proper order of signals. In 1.4, the proper order of authorities. So you want to cite your constitutions first, then statutes, treatises, cases, in a particular order, a chronological order by court. So these are some kind of small details authors tend to gloss over a lot that you'll be wanting to check. Rule 2 are typeface conventions for law review, so this is something you'll be paying attention to. And this runs over how we use typefaces in text as opposed to footnotes. One thing to remember is case names. When you are stating a case name in a text, in the text of the article, it's italicized. When you're stating the case name in a footnote, and it's the first time you've stated it, you're doing a full cite, all Roman type. It's not italicized. When you mention that case again in a short cite, then it is italicized. So that's an important little hiccup to remember. So if you look under A, you'll notice there, gives you an example. So Lochner v. New York in your first full cite in a footnote, all Roman type. You go down to the bottom for the short form of it, Lochner, and it's in italics. And again, that's just for footnotes. And in text, you always use case names with italics. Books and the names of periodicals, well, I'm sorry, that's not actually correct. Yeah, okay. Books and the names of periodicals and footnotes are in small caps. But when you're citing the names of periodicals in the text, it's not in small caps, it's in italics. And the same is true for books. So just always be referring back to this to make sure that's correct. All right. This is a weird one, 2.1F. Look at, okay, so let's say you are citing a periodical, right, and the title is italicized. Normally, you italicize the title. After the title's over, you put a non-italicized comma and move on. What if the end of the title of the article is in quotation marks? Well, the rule is that you always place quotations, or I'm sorry, a comma inside a closing quote, right? And that remains true even when, in this situation I'm just talking about. So look at the bottom example there, Nancy Reagan. Just say, whoa, you have a non-italicized comma inside the italicized closing quote, which is really sort of not intuitive to me, so that's something to keep in mind. .2 pages, and 3.1 is important too. So this is just simply if you're listing or referring to sections within a statute, if you're referring to parts or pages, ranges of pages, or for example, if you're referring to footnotes, this will have all your rules for that. So, for example, you may want to cite to a footnote, in which case, if we look under 3.2b, you would have the page number and period footnote. Let's see here. Where is that example at? There's other examples where, let's say you want to refer to text on a page and a footnote on the page. Where did that go? Well, rather than look through this whole thing and find this for you, it's all in here somewhere. So, like, let's say I want to refer to text on page 47 and a footnote that starts on page 47. You would have 47 and 47 and dot 12. Okay. So all these little rules are in 3.2. This is one you'll go back to a lot. 3.5, internal cross-references. This causes a lot of confusion and is an important one to keep in mind. When you're using supra and infra to refer back to a portion of text, a group of authorities, or an entire footnote, what you're doing there is an internal cross-reference. And you'll see in 3.5 they say, the last sentence before the examples are listed, a variety of forms may be used. So, see supra, text accompanying these notes, or see the notes and accompanying text, or see the sources cited within this particular note, or see the discussion. So there's a little bit of flexibility in how you can write those, but what we want to keep in mind is that when you're using supra and infra in this sense, you're not referring to individual sources, you're referring to the footnote or some portion of the article or footnote. That stands in contrast to, I'm going to skip to the bottom here, 4.2, when you're using supra as a short form for a particular source. Okay, and if we turn to 4.2 on page 74, supra can be used for a number of kinds of sources they list, but should not be used for cases, statutes, constitutions, etc. So that rule will tell you what sources you can and cannot use supra for as a short cite. So it's not okay to use supra to refer back to a particular case within a footnote that is above. But let's say you are referring to a footnote that has a whole bunch of cases listed in it. Then it's okay to use supra as an internal cross-reference and say, see that footnote and the sources in it. So there's a distinction between referring to a chunk or a portion of something in the text and referring to a particular source. When you're referring to the particular source, you need to be careful about what you're using the supra for as a short cite. So that's something that causes a lot of confusion. If you have any questions, always feel free to ask me or your executive editor. Now let's go back to 4.1. These are IDs. And I think we're probably all familiar with IDs. You cannot use ID for an internal cross-reference. And let's see here. I had an issue come up recently, actually. Well, I'm not finding it. Where was it? In any event, the rule about id is, let's say you're going to use id to refer to a source that was in the previous footnote. The only time you can do that is when the previous footnote only has one source. Otherwise, it's confusing as to which one you're referring back to. However, what if that one source has a cite and then it says quoting another source, right? Inside an explanatory and parenthetical, there's another source. Those don't count for id, right? And actually, I want to point that rule out to you because that's cropped up a little bit too. I was emailing about it recently, so maybe I can just find it. Sorry.
Does it pop up on page 73? Example of that name?
Yeah, maybe that is. Where are you seeing that?
Footnote 18 and 19. Page 73.
Oh, yeah, so that is an example, and they specifically reference it in 4.1, second to last. Yeah, there you are. You got it. Thank you. Okay, so if we look at sources identified and explanatory parentheticals, the second to last sentence on page 73. Sources identified in explanatory parentheticals, phrases, or prior and subsequent histories are ignored for the purposes of this rule. So when you're doing it, keep that in mind. All right. Questions? That's a little bit confusing, but is that clear? Was I clear on that? All right. 5. Quotations. Now, I want to cross-reference the Texas Manual on Usage and Style rule quickly, which is 8.04 B and E. Which is on page 65. And I know some of you have this in PDF form, so I'll give you a minute to find it. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with ellipses. When you omit a portion of the text, you have 3 periods. One important thing to remember about that, and this is something you really need to remember, those periods are always separated by non-breaking spaces. So in Word, in your word processing software, you should be able to find a command for a space that does not break, which means, the ellipses will not break across a line break. It'll stay an entire chunk, right? And I'm going to cover that again in a later rule, but remember that. And if you're citing or quoting a source and you omit either the beginning of a sentence or an entire sentence, 8.04b and E come in. So, and if we look at 8.04b, use an ellipsis to indicate an omission from the beginning of a sentence, unless the ellipsis would begin the quotation. If the ellipsis is used, this is important here, place the same number of spaces after the last ellipsis dot as you would place between sentences ending with a period. So look at the example here. Because we follow the 2-space rule between sentences, when you're using an ellipsis like that, the final dot in the ellipsis has 2 spaces after it, not 1. So in those situations, we maintain the 2-space rule. The same is true if you're omitting an entire sentence, which is what 8.04e is about. That's another issue I've seen crop up a lot. People tend to miss that. So that's something to keep in mind. And Rule 8 in Texas Manual on Usage and Style, Rule 5 here also talk to you about block quotes. Something else that pops up a lot. What if an author quotes in a parenthetical more than 50 words, right? We all know that if you're quoting more than 50 words, you set it off indented ½ an inch on each side, separated by spaces. But what if the author is using that in an explanatory parenthetical? Well, bring that to the executive editor's attention so the executive editor can communicate with the author. If a quote is so important, of 50 words or more, that you're going to use that many words, we want to really ask the author, is this merely an aside in an explanatory parenthetical, or do you want to quote it? But if they choose to, quotes inside explanatory parentheticals do not get treated like regular block quotes. You won't offset those. And that they cover that in the last sentence of 5.01 double I. In law review footnotes, where the quotation is placed within a parenthetical, it should be enclosed in quotation marks and not otherwise set off from the rest of the text. So that's a question that I've received quite a bit. Also, indicating paragraph structure can be a little confusing, so if you happen to get a block quote that omits entire paragraphs from the source, this is where you'll go for that. And we're also being cognizant of situations where you use 3 dots in an ellipsis versus 4, right? I'm not going to go over the details there, but that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you're putting the ellipsis afterwards for the 4 dots, do you put
Yeah.
the first period without a space before or after the last letter, or do you have a space or do you not have a space there?
That depends if you're omitting the end of a sentence or the beginning of the next sentence. So if your source text has some sentence and you're going to omit this portion, then you will have space, dot, space, dot, space, dot. Okay, and then this will be, consider this the actual period, right? If instead you're omitting this portion, that all gets shifted over.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And if that was the case, remember that 2-space rule, right? And again, always an open line of communication. We expect on your first assignment to get lots of questions. If you're not asking lots of questions, either you're very good with detail or you should be paying more attention. And I know we're covering a lot here. I just would like to at least say that I reviewed some of these particular rules with you. So if it's overwhelming, just, you know, you'll get a hands-on moment very soon here to kind of dig in and figure this all out for yourself. Okay, 6 is abbreviations. So if you're ever curious why, you know, F3rd for an appellate federal reporter didn't have a space, but F-sup did, this will answer that question. I know it's a burning question in your mind. Keeps you up at night. But this covers when we put spaces between abbreviations, when we don't, why. There we go. Capitalization can be really important. Remember, we don't capitalize. If we look at 8A, capitalize words in a heading or title, including the initial word, and any word that immediately follows a colon. Do not capitalize articles, conjunctions, or prepositions that are 4 letters or fewer, unless they begin a title or immediately follow a colon. And abbreviations get a little hairy. We abbreviate the titles of journals differently than we abbreviate case names and institutional authors, which we'll get to shortly here. That's not covered in this rule, that's covered later. Okay. Oh, I keep going the wrong way here, sorry. Case names. Now, this is the one rule that every 1L has to have covered like 1,000 times, so I won't spend too much time on it. Remember that 10.2.1 tells you rules that apply to all cases, whether you are referring to them in the text or the footnote. 10.2.2 supersedes 10.2.1 for cases that are for footnotes or in citation sentences. Excuse me. I had to make that distinction because you may mention a case in the text of a footnote, right, where the case name is being mentioned grammatically in the text of the footnote. 10.2.2 is for citations. Remembering, though, that in footnotes you do use citation clauses, so you may have some text, comma, formal citation, comma. So be cognizant of whether the case is being mentioned in a footnote in a textual context or as a citation clause. That'll affect how you treat that text or a case differently. Okay, so case names in text, italicize and you only abbreviate it according to Rule 10.2.1. So you'll see, as we go through here, there's all, procedural phrases, abbreviations for like association, brothers, company, etc. There are all these little rules on how we abbreviate that. So if it's being mentioned in the text, that's what you look to. Geographical terms, same way. Remember, the United States is only ever abbreviated when it's used as an adjective. But if it's the name of the party, you do not abbreviate it. So there's a bunch of little rules you'll be going through a lot. And then as we continue over to page 94, 10.2.2, additional rules for case names in citations. So the main differences are this. You never, ever abbreviate the first word in a party's name when you're referring to a case in text, right? However, when you're referring to a case in a citation, you always abbreviate it according to table T6, whether it's the first word or not. You may have been told differently by your adjunct because the previous edition of the Blue Book had a little bit different rule on that, but that's what the rule is now. Additionally, as I mentioned before, you do not italicize the case for its first full citation. You use Roman type. Okay. So there are important differences to keep in mind there. I think we covered all that. 10.6 is parenthetical information following a case. Emphasis added, citing this, quoting this, etc. Those need to happen in a particular order, so I'll point you to 10.6.3. Okay, and this gives you an idea of the order of the parentheticals. And that also cross-references Rule 1.5b, which gives you a fuller list of how those ought to be ordered. If we turn to 1.5b, page 60, this is a really handy one, which I know I went to a lot. And this was something that I always went to as the last step in spading, because you get the form down, you get everything right, but then every source needs to be listed and every parenthetical in the right order. So this is maybe a kind of house cleaning last item to do, and this tells you what order to put these things in. Statutes. We only, and I mean only, cite to official codes and only to the print edition of those official codes. You may be familiar with, and this is actually, I'm going to go to this real quick. This is a great resource, but it's not an official resource. Okay, so this is a good way to check things, but you may not cite to it. That is the Government Printing Office's website. Are you all familiar with that? Okay, so this has official, not official, excuse me, publications of the United States Code. Also, I think it has the Federal Register, other federal sources that you'll need. Okay, so the United States Code, this is a good way you can just, maybe you need to know what the span of sections is for a particular act, something like that, or maybe you wanted to know what the code was back in 2002. You can go check that out, but as you'll notice here, okay, well, first of all, notice here, titles that have not been enacted in positive law are, oh, that's not what I wanted. In any event, somewhere in here there's a disclaimer that says this is not an official source. So when you're citing to the U.S. Code, you grab the books off the shelf, you look it up, that's it. Same way for the Nebraska statutes.